letter finds you well. My name is V.O. Kim Thang, and I'm writing to submit my visa application to see if I can tag along with my son to the Writers' Residency Program in Montreux, Switzerland, which is not sponsored by the Jan Michalski Foundation, which I can also totally understand. They do support my son the whole way through, though, which is very kind of them. As a mother, I am very happy for him and grateful for them. My passport details are as follows. It has always been my dream to travel to Europe. It is a land that I know very little about. I heard that the mountains were very beautiful. I also heard about fields of green grass running indefinitely towards the horizon. I heard that winters there were cold and there would also be snow. Snow, I have never seen snow before. Is it similar to a hailstorm? I got caught in a hail shower once when I was a teenager. The ice cubes hit my back and they left very ugly bruises. The worst thing was they destroyed my cabbage garden. I was very sad, but I guess snow is better, right? They look like cotton floss on the ground, or at least that is what I see in the pictures that my son shows me. It will be March when my son arrives in Switzerland. I will make sure to pack him plenty of warm clothes so that TSA will let him through. I hope the weather will be kind enough for his sinusitis. It runs in the family. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I used to be a tailor, a very famous one. I made clothes for people in my hometown. I also taught my craft to those who wanted to learn it. Some of my students graduated and have opened their own tailoring services. I was very happy for them. When I was not making customer clothes, I would be sewing stuff for my son. I made him a little handkerchief with a cartoon character that he pulled out from a comic book. I remember him bringing it to the daycare and showing it to every one of his friends. Recalling that memory always puts a smile on my face. I am now a stay-at-home mom. My eyesight has gotten worse by the day, and my back could never withstand sitting next to the machine longer than 30 minutes. 30 minutes, not enough to do anything now. Threading the floss through the tiny needle's hole takes me at least 5 minutes nowadays. Can you believe it? I guess I'm just old. My hobby is ballroom dancing with my friend. Not any kind of fancy moves, though, as we say, for health. Dancing is good for my aging joints, but I'm also glad I still have friends at this age. My husband does not like me dancing. He does not think that it is appropriate for Vietnamese women of my age to do so. Regardless, I do me. I have always been like that. Sometimes we fight about it and our relationship sours little by little. And then dancing helped me temporarily forget about that. It is like living in a flaming house and everyone suffering from 4th-degree burns. But nobody wants to give up on their gasoline jugs. But enough of the sad thing. I'm sorry if this makes you sad. I just realized that I know very little about what my son does. He said he is an artist and writer. I remember my blood boiling when he said he wanted to do that after college. But now he is traveling the world with his art. So there's no reason for me to not trust him. I always wanted him to be able to travel outside of this country. There is so much pain in this place and so many things to learn elsewhere. I want him to live this life the way he wants it. And I'll do anything to support him on that matter. That yours, Representative, you can have my word. My son always told me I was the first artist in the household and he picked it up after me. To be honest, I did not understand what he meant by that, but I can tell you I was flattered. He once showed me a piece that he had written, but I could not understand anything because I did not speak any English, although I noticed there was a word that he used a lot, queer. It translates into something along the lines of strange or monstrous in Vietnamese. Why does he think he is monstrous? He is the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me, even though I could not understand why he is so sad sometimes. He told me it was just a slang of his generation, but I have my doubts. There is so much I cannot understand. However, I do not think it is important. I'm sure he will tell me when he is ready. One thing I can be sure that I am very proud of him. At the time this letter reaches you, he will be speaking about his art and our stories in a very big auditorium. I wish I could be there to see him too. I hope in the future I will be able to speak about his art and his writing to the people around me. It is hard to learn new things when you are approaching your 70s, but there is nothing a mother cannot do. Even if all I can see is his shadow under the light, I cannot see nor reach. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Kim Tang.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Can you hear me okay? Good? Cool. So, my name is Tam Nguyen, and the most comprehensive way to describe myself is something in between of a writer, an artist, and a researcher. Oh, and please give it up to my mother. She did the hard work of doing the opening speech for me. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening to attend the Jeudis en Résidence sections of March 2024. Thank you, Thomas, for arranging this event, and I like to believe that we're here together because the stars decided to align in such a way. In fact, I'm still having a hard time believing that I'm now a Yamikansky writer in residence, and being on the stage today feels absolutely surreal to me, and I'm eternally grateful. And in all honesty, though, I didn't plan to be super organized for today's talk, and even more so, I wanted to, have a rather informal and intimate conversation with you all, telling you a little bit about myself, what I've been working on, and all of these nerdy stuff that I've been obsessed with over the years. But in all seriousness, I think this is also an opportunity for me to reflect upon what I've been doing as a creative person, and I hope that you can bear with me over the next hour as well. So anyway, the video work that you just saw is an audio-visual artwork titled Third World Mother and Her Free World Visa, which was created based on the second chapter of my novel, specifically for today's presentation. And I'll come back to the novel later in the talk, I promise. But the idea for this artwork came from a rather silly place, which is when I was compiling my visa application to enter Switzerland for this residency. And though writing is something I do on a daily basis, dealing with paperwork is among my least favorite things. I get that says a lot about myself as a Gen Z, a generation that is known for cautiously worshipping TikTok and political freedom, and absolutely despising paperwork. But jokes aside, though, I was indeed extremely stressed out during the application process and painted all sorts of horrible scenarios in which I thought to get a visa. The only person that I could came to for comfort at the time was my mother, who actually went out of her way to pray at the local temple every once a week for my success. For my mom and perhaps many Vietnamese mothers as well, praying is their very own way of showing solidarity with their beloved when they doubt. As such, the text for Third World Mother and Her Free World Visa takes the form of a Swiss Schengen visa application letter written by my mother, showing her moral support upon my travel to another country. And then in order to create the audio, I fed my mother's voice into a cloning tool to create a vocal register that retains both of her accent and her speechified mannerisms in the English language. And even though she herself does not speak any other languages besides Vietnamese. So hearing my mother speak English for the first time is pretty mind-blowing to me. I feel very strange as well. But at the same time, I realized that the anxiety that I felt during my visa application process was both historically and politically embodied For me, this anxiety is informed by a loaded history of third world people's struggle for representation, which inadvertently renders them into opportunistic individuals whose true political freedom can only be found in the so-called free world. As an emerging queer artist and writer of color, this free world and third world binary is always present in my creative thoughts. In fact, the creations of this audiovisual performance was informed by another video work by British-Singaporean artist Erica Tan titled A Presentation by Proxy, which was premiered at a special launching event for the volume of text titled Come Cannibalize Us, Why Don't You?, edited by the artist herself in 2012. As the editor of the volume, Tan was tasked to do an opening presentation at the event, but the artist could not attend it in person. So instead, what she did was creating a video in which she computationally generated a voice for Halima binti Abdullah, a Malayan craftswoman who was forced to become a performer of traditional weaving at the 1924 British Empire exhibition in London. During the book launch event, Abdullah critically spoke in place of Tan about the history of colonial exhibitions in metropolitan Europe, and specifically the museological tradition of British museums that rendered her existence into a performative subject under the bewildered and fascinated gaze of the British city dwellers. While the premise about the displacement of cultural objects as a form of historical liquidations is undoubtedly important, I was more interested in the way that Tan plays around with the idea of absence. Abdullah was a very much real historical figure despite her absence in our obnoxiously well-recorded Longue Durée. Erica Tan, by fictionalizing her relationship with the craftswoman when she says, and I quote, "Before I continue, Erica encouraged me to give a little introduction to myself, saying that on these occasions, audiences often required, if not demand, to know one's provenance. This is especially in the case when you step in to replace someone," unquote. Abdullah, once an unknown colonial subject of the British Empire, enters history the way a modern artist of the Euro-Western would have. So in that sense, the relationship between the DC artist Abdullah and the contemporary artist Erica Tan was a shared spiritual mediumship, and thanks to which Tan was able to legitimately excuse her absence from the book launch, and Abdullah's name became engraved in the vast biography of colonial history, one that was inherently designed to erase her existence, her culture, and identity. So a similar logic also underlines the making of my video work, the one that you just saw, Third World Mother and Her Free World Visa, as well as my artistic intervention project titled Prosaic Trānsquīlus, which ended up getting me here at the Vietnamese Foundation as a writer in residence. And believe it or not, I only graduated from my undergraduate training a little less than 9 months ago. So it's safe to say that my imposter syndrome is going very strong. But anyways, that said, I was neither a writer nor an artist by default. I was trained to become an historian specializing in contemporary Vietnamese and Southeast Asian art at an American-sponsored university. So there's a lot there. Art historical writing is an important mode of knowledge productions. However, it always felt to me as a very constrictive form of writing. And like many other fields of research, in order to introduce new discourses or new narratives that are considered significant in academia, an art historian must draw from the existing literature and go from there. That means that there are correct ways of doing art history, and there's also incorrect ways of doing art history. That also means there are important trends to catch their academic languages, to familiarize oneself with, and to ultimately master, which is, in my case, the English language. And there are also prominent works and figures one must cite to garner substantial weight for the research project. And in that sense, writing an art historical paper paper involves a series of conscious selections of theories, narratives, and dialogues driven by a single and/or primal sense of purpose. Here I would like to recite from my essay, Prosaic Trānsquīlus, for the sake of precision. In her 2004 essay, Rosalind Krauss discusses the idea of visual art being constructed as a language and proposition under the rampaging discourse of modernism in American art history. Here, the author also alludes to the idea of art writing as a means of laying down the generic principles of artistic subjects, an attempt to rescue modernist art from the dark pit of postcolonial crisis. Having been trained as a writer within the American academic tradition over the past 4 years, I have committed to this primal sense of purpose a little too well, chasing one historical mapping after another, indulging in selective trivializations of my spirituality and positionality, while art history simply kept doing its thing, expand the literature while being in constant denial of its turbulent ancestry. Argument, topic sentences, supporting paragraphs, abstract, conclusion. This is the clean-cut American way of writing, said my professor stoically. This void became my lost cause, for I no longer whom or what I am rescuing at this point. Has an art historian ever addressed the frustration this way? Has the art historian ever addressed the frustration this way? Was the question that I kept asking myself at that time. I was obsessed with the idea of carving one's name into the densely populated passage of history as a writer. There's something noble about giving representations that I couldn't quite pinpoint at the time. However, I was even more interested in figuring out whether or not representation can be given without the constant need to get in touch with the academic literature as an art historian. So I did a little experiment with my essay, Prosaic Trānsquīlus. I sent the essay away, and for some magical reason, it ended up getting published in Southeast of Now, which is the only peer-reviewed journal dedicated exclusively to delivering scholarship of contemporary South Asian arts under the roof of the National University of Singapore Press. And during the editorial process, which lasted for almost 7 months since my submission, I had the honor to work with Dr. Roger Nelson, who was at the time the co-founder of the said academic journal, and also the very person that became my mentor for the next 6 months during a research fellowship. He was an absolutely lovely man, even though the wait is long. And due to the convoluting natures of the text, Prosaic Trānsquīlus, Dr. Nelson asked me to provide an abstract for it. Bizarre as this was, an abstract for a creative piece of writing, I thought, but as a first-time peer-review contributor, I digressed. However, this specific gesture from Dr. Nelson would eventually enable me to develop Prosaic Trānsquīlus into an artistic intervention project. What I mean is that in the form of an academic research paper, I wrote about my mother and her craft as a seamstress a little less than a decade ago, when her health still allowed her to sit next to the sewing machines for hours on end. In the text, I treated my mother as an art historical figure and her clothing design as artworks. However, I tried keeping the number of citations minimal, and more importantly, I did not assert any specific arguments like an art historical text tends to, and tried distancing myself from the knowledge of art history as much as possible. All I wanted was to tell a story about my mother and the memories that we spent together during my childhood, and the whole art historical paper ordeal, which is an excuse for me to talk about it. And I also created a series of artworks in which I collected clothing designs from my mother's storage and a few family photos to go along with the text, and I had a lot of fun with that. Ultimately, I was relieved to see that Dr. Nelson did not give up on this project, given how ridiculous the premise was at the time. However, little did he know that by creating a small enough space for Prosaic Trānsquīlus to take root in this academic journal, he allowed a woman whose identity, life, and craft were destined to remain oblivious for the rest of eternity to announce her name alongside many established artists of contemporary Southeast Asian art, in the same way that the Malayan craftswoman Abdullah registered herself onto the surface of postcolonial history 100 years later against on art. And when I told my mother about her story being published in a book, she was flabbergasted, but mostly just excited to know that she was then known to a community of people as an artist in her own right. So I wrote the first draft of Prosaic Trānsquīlus in the summer of 2022, merely as a small writing exercise while taking a break from my undergraduate thesis in university. And with this piece, I wanted to ask several questions that I was not able to address during my academic training, including to whom does history give representation, what kind of discourse and dialogue are considered significant, what is considered trivial, and which ways does history facilitate representations, and in which ways does it fail to do so? Due to limited time and resources, the publication for Prosaic Trānsquīlus has not yet addressed the questions as thoroughly as I wanted. For that reason, I decided to embark on another personal research project that I called, well, things that scholars do that aren't quite scholarly of them to do so. A research project, I think. So I ended up with like 2 interesting case studies, and I would love to walk you through them with me here today as well. So in mid-2023, I encountered my first case study, an essay by art historian and curator Carlos Quijón Jr., titled Writerly's Dispositions, which was published earlier in the same journal that Prosaic Trānsquīlus, my essay, was published in. Quijón Jr. wrote this essay as a reflection of his online writing experiment that he started during the pandemic lockdowns, called Tractions Experiments in Art Writing. And in this experiment, Quijón Jr. invited all kinds of people, including scholars and non-scholars participants, to write about art together. And over the span of this experiment, the authors has condensed to us an idea that I think was incredibly powerful when we talk about writing within the context of art. I imagine Tractions are collections of texts on art from people who are not over-invested in the idea of critique, but are instead more inclined towards the general activity of responding to or thinking about art through writing. This is a sense of writing that is dispositional, that is, it is interested in seeing art from the various necessarily prolific vantage points that the different orientation and intimacy of agency around art might elaborate, from the usual critical or artistic, theoretical or fictive, to the bureaucratic or pragmatic, all allowing for different levels of encounters and interest. As such, the result of Quijón Jr.'s experiment is a series of texts where the author says, and I quote again, "The labor of writing and reading enact discrepant experientialities, taps into different worlds from which different knowledge emanates from." So this idea about the relationality of the writing practice speaks strongly to me as an emerging writer and researcher, given that a great deal of what I do always involved struggling through a set of writerly traditions that either triumph over certain discourses or reinforce a number of parameters that are subject to epistemological efficiency and efficiency alone. And I think for anyone who is working or studying to become a scholar, it is an unwritten rule that good scholarship must exclude any sort of intimate responses to both the subject of research and the literature that the research harvests from. This requirement to emotionally disembody oneself and the overall lack of affective dimension from art historical writing is one of the biggest reasons why I decided to write Prosaic Trānsquīlus in the first place. And then I encountered my second case study in the journal Invisible Culture. In 2020, the journal published a special issue that includes questionnaire responses from friends, students, and colleagues of the American art historian and queer theorist Douglas Crimd, who passed away in 2019. The first question that the editors asked the contributors was, what would Douglas Crimd say? Which was a direct reference to another entry dedicated to Crimd's passing by Louis Lawler, published in the October Journal, issue 171. And here's what Lawler did with her entry. She wrote a question, what would Douglas Crimd say? She repeated the question one more time, and then left the entire blank page. To understand what is so special about Lawler's entry in October 171, we must look into the raison d'etre of the October itself, which revolves around its notoriously complex and rigorous scholarship with contribution from America's more well-regarded writers such as Hans Foster, Rosalind Krauss, Annette Michelson, Jonathan Valley, etc. And for many undergraduate art majors like myself, the October Journal was like an almost biblical resource when it's come to contemporary visual culture and theories. And that said, Louis Lawler's entry in October 171 was more or less a direct response to the removal of Douglas Crimd from the editorial board of October in 1990, an incident that had perhaps changed the October Journal forever. A pioneer of American art history with a special passion for queer theories and AIDS activism, Crimd had been advocating for the introductions of contemporary cultural studies into the current orientation of the journal with the publication of October 43 titled AIDS, Cultural Analysis / Cultural Activism, which had conjured hostility from his fellow editors at the time for two separate reasons. One, the monetary success of the October 43 that surpassed every issue that came before it. Scholars need to eat sometime. So two, the unprecedented nature of Crimd's editorship, one that slowly but surely bridging October's untamed patronage of academic discourses regarding high modernism in the late 1980s. And eventually, in 1990, Crimd was fired from his position as the managing editor of the October Journal after being refused from publishing two presentation texts from How Do I Look?, a queer film and video conference organized by the Anthology Film Archives in the same year. Here, I would like to provide Crimd's statement in his own words. My fellow editors came, I think, to resent that October 43 success, and particularly the fact that for a new group of readers, October was Douglas Crimd's magazine and not Rosalind Krauss and Annette Michelson's magazine. Becoming an AIDS activist transformed me intellectually. It transformed what I wanted to work on, and it brought me methodologically closer to cultural studies. I was bringing that perspective to bear at a time when Rosalind and Annette was more or less withdrawn from the day-to-day work of the magazine and had grown tired of it. And for quite a long time, I have considered Prosaic Trānsquīlus a kind of parasite. It appears where it's not supposed to. It does not contribute anything to the so-called literature of art history. It is what I and perhaps many other people are inclined to call useless scholarship. I even thought that its being a peer-reviewed publication has actually moved the field in a backward direction. But what Louis Lawler did with her entry in October 171, the question she asked about the legacy that Douglas Crimd left behind and the blank page dedicated to his bureaucratic absence from October, and one that would eventually become the most transformative moments of in the history of queer studies, have cultivated in me the idea that true scholarship would potentially look like. So what started out as a breakaway from my senior college work for me soon turned into an obsession and a constant search for meaning through the act of writing. And for both Carla Kihon Jr. and Louis Lawler's response to Douglas Crim's, transformative scholarship requires a series of radical, intimate, and relational gestures, writing included, that bridge beyond academia's mastery. Eventually, these ideas became the tipping points for my most ambitious writing project yet, which was to embark on my first novel titled For There Be Snow. This novel tells the story of a Vietnamese boy named Small L and an Iranian-American backpacker named Esan. As the first main character, Small L has always been brimming with a silly obsession with snow. And in order to see snow, he convinces himself that he must one day travel to the free world. On the one hand, Small L's desire to get out of his home country is informed by having access to a great lineup of American writings at a young age, ultimately leading up to his becoming an art historian within the American academic tradition in his later years. On the other hand, he also believes that by escaping Vietnam, he will also be able to emotionally detach from the collective trauma of the Vietnam War that was imposed on him by his father. So a big part of Small L's identity as a character revolves around being a Vietnamese scholar with some formidable ideas about the dynamics between the third world and the free world after the turn of a new decade. So Small L, our characters, meets Esan for the first time during his research trip in Armenia, who would then become his romantic company during his time in the country. As the second main character and an openly gay man, Esan has been finding a good reason to return to his hometown in Tehran, and in the process, he also tries to make sense of how the 2001 terrorist attack in America and the aftermath of the 1975 Islamic Revolution in Iran constituted to his identity as a second-generation Iranian immigrant. He settles in Armenia as well, a country that is just an hour's flight away from Iran, trying to think through his decisions. And to give you a better idea of the novel, I'll read to you the fourth chapter of it, in which the earlier discussions of Louis Lawler's entry in the October journal will reappear. But before that, I would like to give a disclaimer for the audiences here. Our brilliant interpreters who are sitting up there in the cabin has been trying their best, their very, very best to translate like this passage of the talk. And I didn't take into account the fact that a literary text has a lot to work on in terms of translation. And sometimes the literary integrity of the text would not remain the same because it's not a full-on investor's translation project. And it's not their job to do so as well. So I hope that the translation will come out all right. And yeah. Thank you for bearing with us, by the way. Esan woke up to the siren-like alarm howling on his phone, feeling rather bloated. He had been experimenting with his bodily threshold for marijuana, pushing the limit at a rate of one joint every 3 days. Last night, he hit 6, a new record. For a 36-year-old, Esan considered himself relatively healthy as compared to fellow millennials. Even half of their personality on social media nowadays revolves about being able to pay for weekly chiropractic sessions. He wanted a little challenge as neither lung cancer nor pre-parental scoliosis showed up in his latest physical. Other than that, Esan was a big and bulky guy who exercised every morning in his boxers. It was a necessary lifestyle for a backpacker who usually spent hours on them sitting, laying, and slumbering in the airports. He used the money from teaching private English lessons to Asian kids to travel around the world. They usually paid really well. In certain cases, though, being a Persian can be tough, for some Asian parents would never let an ESL become an English tutor for their precious gremlins, documented American or not. Hassan believed it was his beard that gave away his innate Middle Eastern features. Once, the mother of a 7-year-old Thai girl told him that the English language was like a type of antibiotics, and the daughter's mother's tongue was a misplaced immune system. She was fully aware of the corrosive nature of the antibiotic and still wanted her daughter to take it. At the time Hassan signed his contract with the mother, she already had a future mapped out for her daughter, mastering English at the age of 10, German at the age of 14, and with the lowest priority, French, at the age of 18. Her getting into either of the Ivy Leagues was plausible, but preferably Harvard. She had a relative in Massachusetts who considered that dreaded green card registration done. But it also depends on how the next presidential election goes, said the mother over Hassan's computer screen. Immigration laws change every so often. The Americans like to say that it's God's plan. Regardless, I would do anything to get my daughter to America, even if that means defying His holiness. She was sending her daughter to a private school in the next few months, followed by a paid exchange program in the US during the summer. She believed that she was making her father's trust fund worth it, down to the penny. She just needed to be patient. After 3 or so rounds of shirtless push-ups, Hassan took a quick shower and was then ready to hit the road. It was a 1-hour drive from Uzasor to Mavid. He was caught up guard by how cheap the monthly rate of car rental here as compared to the capital city. Besides his bald eagle passport, Hassan's shiny American driver's license worked like a charm in Uzasor, winning him a moss green Jiguli 2106 sedan on a 2-month contract with only mediocre bargains involved. The vehicle itself was in pretty good condition too, considering how obsessed middle-aged Armenian men can get with overtly vintage Soviet automobiles, not only for the sake of collection, but to actually lend them for rent. It was almost the end of summer in Armenia, but the mountains were still visible across the clear blue sky. Considering how empty the road usually was, the rocky landscape helped heighten Hassan's sense of space, making this trip, if not less boring, more purposeful. He rolled down his window and let the wind exorcise the remaining stubborn fume of weed that had accumulated in the car for almost 3 days. Upon entering Arak, Hassan made a U-turn around the local cultural center instead of going straight through the narrow, unplastered alleyways as usual. It was 2 stories tall with a reddish hue from the obnoxiously large pink bricks, varied in tones stacking on top of each other. The building looked far from structurally sound, with a row of huge rectangular shutless windows, or what Hassan has figured to be windows, making up about 90% of the second floor surface. Hassan could see sunlight pouring violently into the empty room through these windows as he drove past the building. Hassan then arrived at a small bus stop. He hit the brake and glanced over at the Soviet poster with a line of Russian text that read, "Don't let a stranger go into your house. If you see an unknown person, call." Below was a colorful, stylized drawing of a uniformed Armenian communist hitting 3 terrified burglars, 1/10 the size of his, with the stock of an assault rifle. The sheer size difference between the giant communists and the tiny group of wincing burglars made him chuckle a little bit. After another turn, Hassan Jiguli stopped before an abandoned-looking bungalow With the Soviet anti-burglary propaganda still fresh in his mind, he took a good look around to make sure that nobody was seeing him awkwardly struggling through the bungalow's bushy lawn and pushed open the gate. He made his way through a small stairway to the upper level of the house, which then revealed an open balcony looking across an empty garden. Looking a little further, Ehsan was able to make out the outline of Mount Ararat and its iconic year-round snowcap. For Ehsan, Ararat was special in the sense that you would be able to encounter such an uncanny, time-gated collisions between two of the world's grandest religious oeuvres. First, Mount Ararat, the resting place of Noah's Ark, holy and gorgeous like freshly baked pastry from the Genesis A4 oven. And second, the distant Salah prayers traveling in the air from the far eastern border of Armenia and Turkey. Ehsan was no longer a Muslim, but at least not after making his parts holy, parts patriotic vow to become what he occasionally referred to as a true American citizen. Still, he pulled himself to sit through the entirety of the prayer at a nearby coffee table and treated himself to the first blunt of wheat for the day. With all things heard, seen, and smoked, Ehsan walked over to the front door of the house and twisted the handle open. It was left unlocked, just as he expected. He walked into the house and headed straight to the master bedroom. Quietly, he put away his shoes and slid under the red blanket on the bed. His hand slowly reached for what appeared to be the naked back of a slumbering young man. He ran his hand across him, slow and observant, and down to where the young man's elastic waistband was. As he carefully moved his finger inside the young man, he let out a series of disjointed grunts. Part of being a gay person for Ehsan was the ability to tell between an irritated grunt and a satisfied one. The young man's grunts at this point in time was a mix of both. "Morning, sleepyhead," said Ehsan, gently stroking Smolel's spread-net worst of hair. "Morning, sex mean no hats. I thought you already knew the deal," responded Smolel, still sounding a little dozy. You could given me a call beforehand, you know," continued Smolel, swabbing up Ehsan's bodily fluid from his chest with a paper tissue. "Well, I'm here anyway," said Ehsan, clearly unbothered by Smolel's rant. "And I think I can go without hats today. Plus, shouldn't you have locked the door? Did you see the Russian poster near the culture center? It seems like burglary is a thing here." "Oh, that thing?" Smolel stood up and began untucking the upper corner of the bedding sheet. "I don't know what's still there, to be honest. You have no idea how hard Armenians have tried to banish the ghost of communism since 1991. Exorcising the Soviet ghost, that's what they call it, I think." Smolel used to picture the iconic scene from The Conjuring with a possessed Stalin tied onto the headboard of the bed in place of Carolyn. And instead of the girl returning to normal, Stalin just combusted into a giant cloud of black dust. Other than that, he didn't realize how much he appreciated exorcising as a verb. He specifically recalled Cornfield quoting Karl Marx during the introduction to modern art course, "All that is solid melts into thin air." However, what Smolel was more interested in was the phrase that immediately comes after that: "All that is holy is profaned." And man is at last compelled to face the sober senses, his real conditions of life, and his relations with its kind. It's that the whole country went through a nationwide rehab, and also because the air here feels different as compared to Vietnam, despite being a former communist state, like politically and culturally unintoxicated, said Smolel. "A sober post-socialist nation, eh?" He was surprised that Ehsan caught on with his private meanderings. "Yeah, I guess you can say that," continued Smolel, thinking how ironic it was as a man's prowess ideological sobriety could totally be read as as blackout drunkenness by another man. Marx was the other man in this case, Smaller thought, except he was already 5 shots of whiskeys in. You know, I came here to find out what this whole post-socialist thing was about, but apart from a few essays written by avant-garde art critics from the late 90s, everything feels and looks so whitewashed. I don't have the word, sorry. Can't say I'm not disappointed because my fellowship literally put post-Soviet on the flyer. Doesn't that kind of scream false advertisement? Smollett went on. He looked at Hassan, still lying on the bed. He grumpily snatched the last bit of the bedding sheet under Hassan's butt. He was looking totally unamused by Smollett talking. Hey, careful, dog. Smollett shot a squinted glance at Hassan. He hated when Hassan spoke like that. Something about his occasional straight guy antique makes Smollett want to send him to another dimension with 10 times the amount of homophobia he would ever encounter here on planet Earth. Sorry, said Smollett as he tiredly flopped onto the now de-sheeted mattress. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, explained Smollett. Plus, it is your cum that stained my bed sheet, my good and hella handsome king of Great Persia. Seriously, I just washed it 2 days ago. Hey, I'm sorry too, said the progressively empathetic Hassan. He turned over and pulled Smollett into his arms. Smollett, as his name suggested, was a small guy, a little too small for his age. His father used to make him chug a full cup of Australian-branded formula every night before bed when he was sick, hoping that he would grow bigger over the years, but the poor boy was forever stuck at 4'9", even after turning 23. Nonetheless, his lying next to the 6'2" Hassan somehow felt like 2 perfectly designed snugglebugs. He dug his head deeper into Hassan's chest. Smollett enjoyed how Hassan smelled, like a mix of fresh almond, rain-soaked dirt, and pine needles. He would never date somebody who refused to use deodorant, but Hassan was an exception. This man just naturally smelled nice. It's okay, it's not like I wasn't part of the fuckscape, giggled Smollett, feeling proud of the new made-up word. As an English learner and a writer, Smollett loved inventing new terms by smashing words together instead of expanding his vocabulary from those SAT-certified word inventories. Fuckscape, shit-throned, depot ditch, gloss grieve, weathered palms, Changinization, which is a new religious conversion therapy that he was currently doing a test run on his beloved millennial Hassan, tree-coated, got armored, and cum-gated. But about the poster, I guess when the USSR collapsed, the whole communist social political system of Armenia went down with it in the blink of an eye, bringing along the then rampaging burglary flake with it. Everyone looks so happy in this country to the point it feels a little suspicious. Even the artists here are eating so well. So I guess petty crimes are not a necessity anymore, no? That's you, boo. That isn't what I heard at all. See the vintage Zhiguli I'm driving? That's peak Soviet nostalgia right there. That's a case study for another day, Hassan. You know, sometimes I think that such collective amnesia can actually be neat. Like one day you wake up and all memories of the old time, the turmoils, the trauma, just gone. You wake up and think of yourself as a new man, said Smollett, immediately regretting saying new man, a term used by communist propaganda during the First Indochina War. Ah, fuck, I mean, you got the idea, right? Like, you wake up one day and suddenly your search for Armenianness turns into a fine dining buffet table. I'm just jealous of the freedom and availability of options they have. You know what I mean? I do, responded Hassan, pulling Smollett closer as he tried changing the topic. But you know what really interested me was the size difference between the communist officer and the burglars in the poster. The resemblance between that and the theater player for Ishiro Honda's Godzilla is uncanny. Well, it's a required aesthetic for socialist posture to be designed so that all the good actors in the social scheme look visually equal. The soldiers, the workers, the farmers, the high-ranked officials. Yes, I know, Hassan remembers Mola giving him this mini lecture before. A thief cannot be the same side as an honorable soldier. I guess even in the socialist ideal, social status still exists. Worse, it is something to be earned, not granted. This is the only time I'm not quite pissed at you putting words in my mouth, says Molo. Want to become my research assistant, good sir? Payment in hand, then we have a deal. Hassan smirked. Haha, no, thank you. It's not like I'm that much of an outstanding scholar anyway. But you've got the point. That's partially the reason why I wanted to get out of Vietnam for a while. Being an art historian, being an artist and an art historian is the worst kind of occupation that you can have, despised and looked down on by everyone. And I'm already knee-deep into it. Hell, even the academia of Vietnamese art is an absolute chokehold situation. You know, my university used to have these two professors who we considered the bookkeepers of my field. One day during lunch, I heard them joking about bin Laden's son hypothetically committing another 9/11 attack against the department's building to avenge his father. And if that was about to happen, God forbid, the whole vanguard behind Vietnamese art research would just evaporate into thin air. No shit, they did not. Yes, they did, John. Worst of all, the so-called terrorist son Omar is an artist and writer. And guess what? I'm also an artist and writer. We are both technically in exile, me in Arax, Armenia, him in Normandy, France. I'm a flaming homosexual. He's not. His father burned out 2 towers. But last but not least, we're both trying to run away from specific passages of human history whose sole purpose is to haunt us, except it's not like I'm making the headlines anytime soon because I'm way too broke and I'm literally feeding off the fellowship money from Armenian government and I'm living rent-free in somebody else's house. Smolle's face turned blue. He was impressed by himself for spitting the entire paragraph in one breath. But you know, sometimes I wondered if it was a curse or a privilege for a scholar to become conscious of their historical importance before they die, and all the wildest shit they would do to maintain their influence in the academic world. Take Douglas Crimm, for example. He was fired from his position as the managing editor of the October Journal, the holy grail of American institutional art theory and criticism, after his proposal to publish 2 papers from a queer art films conference in 1990. By having these papers presented, Crimm wanted intellectual inquiries regarding queer experiences to be addressed beyond our current theoretical endeavors, the avid tradition that October's editors had held on for years. As such, he was removed from the October in the name of visual culture's with assistance, to ultimately prevent him from turning the journal into a political statement of our time. And among all things, Hassan, Cross, and Michelson, who are themselves scholars, decided to deal with Crimm by taking their agency away from him, like true politicians, said Smollett. He made conscious breaks between sentences this time, feeling the words crawling drier and drier down his throat. You know why I wanted to become an art historian? In an October issue dedicated to Crimm's death, Louis Lawler wrote "What Would Douglas Crimm Say" on page 161, twice, and then left a blank page. A black hole in the art historical literature? Absolutely sacrilegious, I thought. But that black hole, Hassan, that sweet, queer, and pathological quietude, possesses an equally pathological escape velocity. Smollett picked his words carefully. That was what I've been looking for this whole damn time. With Smollett had still resting on his arm, Hassan lay speechless. He looked at Smollett, who was staring blankly at his mold-dappled ceiling. He was paying attention but decided to let the silence and the warmth of their bodies pacify his partner's second climax of the day, tried to not think about his own 9/11 predicament. Ehsan understood that both Small-Elf and himself did not come to Armenia from a happy place, but Small-Elf, he thought, was painfully deep into his intellectual, academic, or whatever it is, reasonings. Worse, he felt like that was the only thing that kept him from going absolutely deranged. Nonetheless, he enjoyed every little conversation he had with Small-Elf, for they were both trying to understand what it meant to be living beyond their collective past. Unlike the social status they discussed earlier, these collective values, memory, and political consciousness were something granted to them, more or less against their will. The desire to live as their own person was what brought them together in this country, inside an art gallery in Yerevan, on a Sunday morning in July. Leaning towards the more masculine side on the homosexual spectrum, Ehsan still found it difficult to come back to Iran. During their first day, Ehsan told Small-Elf he would take him to Tehran one day to Ehsan couldn't think of a single activity they could be doing there without stirring unwarranted attention. He appreciated Small-Elf not pushing for a follow-up to do what afterwards. It had been 22 years or so since he moved to San Francisco. Tehran had become a stranger city to Ehsan, if not outwardly hostile. Although he still called his mother every once in a while, they spoke English for the most part. Ehsan Jan, said his mom on the other side of the line, how you do good in America. In a weird way, when he was not yelling absolute nonsense, Small-Elf's soft-spoken voice reminded him of his mother's tenderness, especially with the filler word Jan, which is, except Armenians, pronounced and spelled almost the same as in Farsi, which means dear in English or men in Vietnamese, added Small-Elf. Small-Elf picked that up after his bestie, Sonia, the very person who lent him her own family house to stay for the length of the fellowship, completely free of charge. On Ehsan's end, all he wanted after that first day was to bring Small-Elf home, rearrange his gut, letting that endearing John bounce inside his head like a mason-jarred firefly. I hope you're still awake after all of that. On the one hand, writing for There Be Snow, which is the novel, became an opportunity for me to extend my art historical background into something that I can personally relate to, and in a more selfish way, to enable me to have like many intimate conversations with these thinkers and scholars that I really, really admired, which would have been otherwise impossible with the usual academic settings. On the other hand, though, the novel is also where I can address some of these topics that is especially personal to me. For example, the novel is filled with narratives revealing snippets of Small-Elf's and Ehsan's past that will later result in an instant of transgenerational empathy between the two characters, which is especially relevant to me and many of my friends who are themselves Generation Zs and Millennials, the two generations that grew up during 9/11, an event that forever changed the way we think about our contemporary world and the emotional absurdity that the social-political conditions that came with it. In a small metaphorical sideline, Small-Elf, a Gen Z, and Ehsan, a millennial, must work together to make sense of the universal emptiness that they both feel as young people despite coming from very different places, which is another theme that I would like to explore with this novel during my time here in the residency. So before ending this presentation, I would like to make a reference to Julieta Sinch, a writer whom I share a great deal of creative solidarity during the making of both Prosaic Trānsquīlus and For There Be Snow. In her book, No Archive Will Restore You, Singh wrote, "Why did we stay on with the odds so stacked against us? I don't blame the archive per se, but it undoubtedly held out a kind of promise for each of us that kept us tethered to academia. The archive was an elusive hope for our individual salvation. If we could find the right archive and the right stash of materials that was sexy enough to sell ourselves, we would be spared from the depression, the anxiety attacks, and the pre-midlife crisis that would come when, one by one, we realized that we were not going to be chosen. Cinch never really defined what she means by an archive throughout the entire book, although her desire to find her own archive is undeniably palpable. Otherwise, one may consider this is an example of horrible writing, in the sense that no working definitions are established around the idea of an archive, and at times, the book feels like a stream of consciousness. However, this poetic meandering in between thoughts, theory, and narratives, and the overall lack of scholarly purpose is what makes No Archive Will Restore You such a beautiful and personal work. In many ways, Cinch's search for her archive also served as an opportunity for her to unlearn what has become of our masterful practices and traditions in the academic world. On a side note, as a queer and feminist scholar herself, I figure that this unknown archive, this broken thing, as she calls it, speak a great deal to the rearticulations of queer representation that Douglas Krim, the figure that I mentioned earlier, had been advocating for since his removal from the October Journal. And also, very much like Cinch, despite all of these difficulties posed by my practice and studies as an art historian, I don't want to give up on academia just yet, so the best I can do is to continue writing alongside these experimental margins. Here, I also like to think of Fouette Bisno as my first step towards finding my own archive as a researcher and above all as a creative writer. Cinch finds new meaning by employing her scholarship in unconventional contexts, and her search for the archives also resonates with my character Small L, with his absurd search for snow in the free world. But don't get me wrong, Truetta Cinch is an extremely rigorous literary researcher in her own right, and it's safe to say that No Archive Will Restore You is an abomination that she was willing to commit for the sake of fighting the true meaning of scholarship and the writing practice at large. With Cinch being my obsession at the time, I recommended this book for a theory reading class in my college, and needless to say, I was outrightly rejected. The text is too poetic for critical reading, my professor told me. However, this also signals to me that the ultimate archive is nowhere to be found just yet. And for that reason, I would like to organize a community-engaged performance titled There Isn't a Time and Place for Everything. Here we will discuss the selections of critical poetic texts that were deemed unfit for my undergraduate theory courses, including Truetta Cinch, No Archive Will Restore You, and Thinking Mastery, and Maggie Nelson, The Argonauts. With this out of the way, I would like to extend an invitation to our community here and our audiences at the Chan Mikansky Foundation to participate in this performance together. And on the screen, you can see the little QR code with the little maxi on the side, leading to my Instagram account, where I will post further information about the event if you are interested in participating in the performance with me. And that said, that's everything I have for today's presentation. Thank you so much for your time. And also, we have a cocktail party upstairs. If you guys are still interested in some of the things I've been talking about, wanted to continue with all of this conversation, we can upstairs. And free wine. Everybody wants that. So thank you so much.